There have been a total of 7 manga discontinued from Viz Media's Shonen Jump line, and in this video, I'm going to talk about all of them. Viz Media was formed back in 1986, but it was in 2003 that they would then create the Shonen Jump imprint, which would wind up becoming home to many of the world's most popular manga series. However, when the imprint first began, it was just a monthly magazine. And in the magazine, it did start with a few familiar titles like Dragon Ball Z, Yu Yu Hakusho, and Yu-Gi-Oh!, but it also added some titles that were not familiar to English audiences, like Naruto, One Piece, and Shaman King. And more series would continue to join the magazine as it went forward, such as Hikaru no Go, and eventually parts of Bleach were in there as well. But there were a lot of series that were published outside of the magazine that were extremely popular as well. Series such as Hunter x Hunter and Death Note. And the Shonen Jump line is still home to some of the most popular manga to this day, including My Hero Academia, Demon Slayer, Promised Neverland, Haikyuu, Chainsaw Man, and Jujutsu Kaisen. However, while it's very rare nowadays to see a manga discontinued before it's completely published in English, back in the mid to late 2000s, it wasn't that uncommon to see that happen. And in the history of the imprint, there have been 7 titles that were unfortunately discontinued before they were completed. In this video, I'm going to go ahead and talk about each of those 7 titles, and I'm going to go through them in alphabetical order, but I will be saving the most recent one for last because the situation of that title is a little bit different. As I go through each of these individual series, I'm going to give a synopsis so you know what the series was about. I'm going to talk about how long the series was in Japan, or if it's still going on, how long it is, and then I'll mention how many of those volumes were published in the US before it was discontinued. And finally, I'll talk about what I think as far as chances of this series coming back and the rest of it being published are. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on in to talk about the first series on the list. Kicking off the list is Beat the Vandal Buster by Riku Sanjo and Koji Inada, and if those names happen to sound familiar to you, it's probably because they're the creators of the Dragon Quest Adventure of Dai manga, and I'll actually have some more to say about that one in just a minute. Now, Beat the Vandal Buster follows our titular character of Beat, who is, as the title suggests, a Vandal Buster. Set in the Dark Ages, basically we have a bunch of things running around called Vandals, that's supposed to be a portmanteau of the words devil and vampire put together. And so basically Vandal Hunters are just killing all of them. It's a very RPG feeling action-adventure series, and that kind of makes sense given the fact that this team also did the RPG-inspired Dragon Quest manga. Now, the Vandals themselves can range from being pretty simple, easy-to-beat monsters to being more complex foes for the protagonist to deal with. And as the series went forward, he would accumulate a team, more members to join him on his mission, and they would meet and fight many strong Vandals as well. Beat would make more friends, he'd fight new Vandals, he'd get new weapons. Very RPG-inspired story. It's a pretty simple one, but it's a lot of fun as well, and I really enjoyed reading this one back when it was originally published in English. Now in Japan, Beat the Vandal Buster is actually still ongoing, with its most recent volume, 15, having been released in 2020. However, in English, it stopped being published after volume 12. And the reason for this was because in Japan, the series went onto a 10-year hiatus. Volume 12 was published in 2006 in Japan, and then 2007 in the US. And it wasn't until 2016 that Volume 13 was released in Japan. And during that 10-year break between Volume 12 and 13, essentially Viz Media decided the series just wasn't selling well enough for them to worry about putting a 13th volume out. And from a marketing standpoint, I think that unfortunately makes sense, because if it wasn't already popular, putting a 13th volume out is really not going to grab anyone's attention, and it would take a lot of money to go in and just reprint the entire series for anyone who hadn't seen it before. And a lot of people, myself included, I had actually sold the series, like I'd given up on it and sold it off because not only was it not coming back in English, at the time that I sold the volumes, it wasn't even coming back in Japan. So at this point, there are 3 more volumes in Japan than what we had in English, and it has been back though on an irregular schedule for the past 5 or so years, with new material being published. Now, the chances are low that this one gets brought back in English, but it's not impossible. I mentioned the Dragon Quest manga earlier, and that manga for the first time is getting published in English in the near future. Viz Media just announced that the Dragon Quest Adventure of Dai manga would be released, and they're releasing it in the new 25-volume collection that was released in Japan somewhat recently in celebration of the new anime. And of course, the anime is kind of the reason why they would publish it in English for the first time, and I was hoping that that would happen. I was hoping that the popularity of the anime, what popularity there is for the Dragon Quest anime, would inspire this to happen. And with that, there's that smallest inkling of a chance, that small little possibility that Viz Media could possibly think, let's go ahead and put out volumes 13, 14, and 15. Because now they can put a label on those books saying from the creators of Dragon Quest: The Adventure of Dai. There is something that could push people to buy it. Now, of course, it'd be smart for them to also reprint the first 12 volumes, and they could do a quiet reprint like they did for Banana Fish back when that anime came out, and just put them all out there so that once those new volumes come out, if there are people who are interested in picking them up, they can easily go back. Now, the series at this point, at least last one I checked, isn't too expensive if you do want to buy it on like the secondhand market. It's not in print and readily available at like places like Right Stuff. It's not going to really be at Barnes & Noble or on Amazon, but on Amazon and eBay you can find used copies, and they're not going to be terribly expensive if you're interested in picking it up. So next up on this list is the weirdest series that I'm going to be talking about in this video, and not only is the series itself weird, but it has the strangest release of any manga that I've seen come out in English, and I'm of course talking about Bobobo-bo Bo-bobo. Now, the series itself focuses on our title character of Bobobo-bo Bo-bobo, who is a large muscular man who fights using the fist of the nose hair. As that name suggests, he fights people with his nose hairs. He's joined by a bunch of his friends and partners, including a dude that farts a lot, a guy that's made out of jelly, and a guy that looks like some sort of like sun or starburst, and some other people as well, as they fight against a group of people who basically want to shave the entire kingdom and get rid of all the hair. So yeah, like I said, the plot's very strange. And this series is meant to be like a parody on a lot of popular shonen fighting manga. It is an action comedy, heavily leaning on the comedy side, leaning into absolute absurdity with its concepts and its jokes and stuff. But it is referencing a lot of things like Fist of the North Star and other popular manga and anime franchise that at the time when this was released in the US, there may not have been a lot of accessibility to, so a lot of the jokes that appeared in this series likely fell flat or flew over the audience's head. Now, the anime adaptation of this series was actually aired on Cartoon Network, and so with that, I believe that Viz decided to kind of ride off of the popularity. I don't know how popular the anime actually was. I watched a few episodes, but I really didn't know anyone at that time that watched it. But they decided to try and capitalize on that, and they did release this volume. This single volume was put out by itself. It's not numbered. It's just called Bobobo-bo Bo-bobo, and it was put under the Shonen Jump Advanced line. Now, here's where the weirdness of the publishing begins. This does not collect the first volume of the Japanese release. It collects most of Volume 9 and most of Volume 10. Skipping out on the first few chapters of the Japanese Volume 9, and then leaving out the last few chapters of the Japanese Volume 10. And it gets weirder from there. Later, it would be added into the monthly Shonen Jump magazine, and they would start it up from Volume 11 of the Japanese release, which means that they skipped a few chapters after that volume that had already been published in English, and went straight into another volume, Volume 11. This Volume 1 in English, you can see it has a Volume 1 on there, is basically just the Japanese Volume 11, and they continued forth by giving us a second volume. This is Volume 12 of the Japanese release. Our Volume 3 is Volume 13 of the Japanese release. Volume 4 means 14, and then finally Volume 5 is the Japanese Volume 15. So we had Most of Volume 9 and most of Volume 10, as well as Volumes 11 through 15, of a series that lasted for 21 volumes with a 7-volume sequel. We got a random 6.5 volumes out of 28 published in English. Yeah. So what are the chances that this series is brought back and published in English again by Viz? Number one, you have to consider the fact that they wouldn't just be publishing anything like... With Beat the Vandal Buster, they could just come in and publish volumes 13, 14, and 15. But with this series, they would have to go back to the beginning and publish the entire thing all over again. They're not just going to come in and do the stuff before what they published and the stuff after what they published and then throw in those extra chapters and call them the lost chapters or something like that. They would have to start from scratch. Now, the only thing that adds any precedence to the idea that Viz Media might want to resurrect Bobobo is that the Blu-ray of the entire anime was released somewhat recently. I have no idea how well the Blu-ray sold. I don't know if that really gives them any precedence to want to publish the rest of this manga. I would love to see it published. I would love to see the entirety of that series published. I just don't think it's very likely to happen. I would be extremely surprised if we ever saw Bobobo come back. This next series is, without a doubt, the most popular of all of the discontinued titles that I'm talking about in this video, and with that, it's also the one that I think has the most chance of actually being brought back, for more than just that reason though, and that of course is Gintama. Now, Gintama, if you're unfamiliar with the series, is set in the future and focuses on the samurai named Gintoki. And Gintoki is basically just, he takes odd jobs to make money to pay rent, along with his roommates. It's a comedy series, it's an action series. The plot does develop further and introduce a lot more characters and more storylines and stuff, but largely it's a comedy action that relies a lot on referential comedy towards other manga and anime franchise, just like Bobobo did, except it's not as absurd of a plot as Bobobo. Now, the series in Japan lasted for 75 volumes. The majority of the series was published in the weekly Shonen Jump magazine, and it was actually one of the contemporaries alongside the big three. The material for the latter couple of volumes was actually published outside of the magazine, though, with some of it actually appearing in a Gintama specific app. So in total, 75 volumes, and in the US, we got a whopping 23. So not even 1/3 of the total amount of volumes. The last volume was published in February of 2011, and at that time in Japan, they had 38 volumes, I believe. So we were already like 15 volumes behind at that point. Now, while the popularity of the series just was not there at the time, and I would say it's likely because of the fact that it so heavily relies on reference towards existing anime and manga that a lot of the audience at that time may have not been aware of. But now with today's increased availability for anime and manga, this series has become much more popular over time, as much more of its audience, much more of the English-speaking audience, is familiar with what series Gintama is actually referencing. And with that popularity come a ton of people who, if this series was brought back, would absolutely, day one, buy those books. Myself included. Now, there are multiple reasons why I say that this is the most likely series to come back of all of these discontinued titles. And number one, of course, is the level of popularity. But number two is the fact that it's never been taken out of circulation. It's not out of print, it's only currently out of stock. But if you go on sites like Right Stuff Anime, they don't list it as unavailable with the, red ribbon and X on there. They haven't taken the volumes down from the site like they have with basically all of the other series I'm talking about. The series is still listed, every volume is on there. Some of them are actually available to buy right now, with the other volumes all listed as out of stock, expecting more soon. And the next thing that makes me feel like this series has any chance to be brought back is the fact that it's also one of the only two of these discontinued titles that is listed on Viz Media's website under their Shonen Jump line. All of the other discontinued titles, except for Gintama and Bobobo-bo Bo-bobo of all series, are still listed as series under their line. And not just are the rest of those discontinued titles missing, but also some titles that were not discontinued, like Legends and Dragon Drive. Those are just not listed at all. I'm not saying that this is definitely going to be coming back into print, but what I am saying is that of all the discontinued titles that I'm speaking of in this video, Gintama is the most likely to come back, and it is the most likely to sell well. Now, the only thing that I would say is holding it back is the length of the title, and I feel like if they did bring it back, then Viz would probably wind up doing 2-in-1 or 3-in-1 releases. Either way, a 75 volume series, even when put into 2-in-1s or 3-in-1s, it's going to take a while for it to be published. But at the end of the day, however they decide to bring it back, I hope that they do. Next up is a series that most people watching this video have probably never even heard of, and that is Kurohime. Now, Kurohime is a manga about a gunslinging witch who has all kinds of magic abilities and can control dragons and stuff using her magical guns. She tries to fight against the gods, but she fails, and they basically split her into two personalities. And the only way that she can return to her original form with all of her original powers is through the power of love. In Japan, the series began in 2000 and ran until 2007 in the monthly Shonen Jump magazine. And then from 2007 until 2011, it moved over to Jump Square. Now, the series never gained much traction, not just in the US, but honestly in Japan. While there were people that really loved this manga, it never got an anime adaptation, and the only additional media I could find was of a PlayStation 2 game. In Japan, the series wrapped up with 18 total volumes, the first 14 of which were made up of all the chapters from the monthly Shonen Jump magazine, while the latter part were made up of all the chapters from Jump Square. However, unfortunately in the US, the last volume we got was number 14, which is really aggravating because that means we were 4 volumes away from having the entire series. And honestly, at this point, I just feel like they could have thrown us a bone and just released those last 4 volumes, even if the sales were poor, just to wrap it up. I understand with longer running series like Gintama or Reborn that they have to make that decision of whether they want to keep putting money into this sinking ship, where every book is going to have a lower number of sales than the last. That's going to be especially harmful to their numbers when it's a very long-running series. But when you have something that literally just has less than a handful of volumes left before its conclusion, come on. Like, I feel like you can just throw us a bone here. But the biggest issue is the entire lack of familiarity and popularity with this series means there's pretty much zero reason for Viz to decide to publish those last 4 volumes in English. And with that, this is probably one of the least likely manga that we see brought back and have the remainder of those volumes printed. Now, these next 2 series are ones that I don't physically have in my collection to show off, but the first one is one that I did own and I did purchase as it was coming out. And I absolutely loved the series. It was one of my favorite ongoing titles at the time, and I sold the volumes along with a lot of these other ones that I'm actually talking about that I've reacquired throughout the years because it was discontinued, and obviously there were no plans for us to get the next volume. While I've been able to recollect the rest of these series, this one is quite a bit harder to find for good prices, and of course, I'm talking about Reborn, or as it's known in Japan, Katekyo Hitman Reborn. Reborn follows the story of Tsuneyoshi Sawada, who basically discovers that he's next in line to become the heir of a mafia family. And he's very unsuspecting, like you wouldn't suspect him to become that kind of thing. He's just kind of a skinny, nerdy Japanese high schooler. So this family sends one of their agents, a hitman named Reborn, hence the title, who takes the form of a baby, to train him, to make him able to be this mafia boss. Now, where the series starts out being more comedic in nature, it soon turns into an action series, and at that point where it migrated from being mostly comedy to being an action series, that's where it really became one of my favorites. It has such a fun supporting cast of characters, each of which have their own very individualized fighting styles, and it was such a different series from everything else that was on the shelves at the time. However, unfortunately, the sales on this title were not great, and after 16 volumes, it was canceled in the US. Which is less than half than the total amount of content there was in Japan, as the series lasted until volume 42. Of all the series that I'm talking about here though in this video, I think that this one has the second most likely chance to be brought back right after Gintama. Unfortunately, Reborn doesn't have all the same factors going for it as Gintama does. Whereas Gintama is just currently out of stock and we're waiting for new copies of the volumes to be printed, Reborn is out of print and there's not currently any plan to bring it back. As well, while Gintama alongside Bobobo of all series are still listed on Viz Media's website under the Shonen Jump brand, we do not have Reborn listed anywhere on the site. So unfortunately, it's gone the way of the rest of these discontinued series, where it seems like Viz is just trying to forget that they existed. However, there's still a large fan base for Reborn, and like I mentioned before with Bobobo, it too has had a recent re-release of the entire anime series on Blu-ray. There are many people who are familiar with and love this series to this day from either watching the anime or having read the manga, and there are many collectors who are trying to add the existing volumes of Reborn in English to their collection right now. But on top of all that, Reborn also has one more thing going for it, and that's that creator Akira Amano is responsible for other popular titles, including a currently ongoing series from Jump Plus. Amano was responsible for the character designs of the Psycho Pass series, and her series Eld Live is available on some of the Shonen Jump apps and the Manga Plus app. And she also has the currently ongoing series Ranko Monohashi Deranged Detective, which you can read officially on the Manga Plus app with the official English translation. So with the amount of fans that are out there for the Reborn series and for Amano's other works, I feel like there is at least a small chance that Reborn could be brought back, and I would really love to see it. However, unlike Gintama, since this series is officially out of print and out of circulation, I feel like it would do well to go back and either reprint those initial 16 volumes again, or possibly release new editions starting from the beginning. I would do 2-in-1 editions similar to the Kuroko basketball series. Those are great 2-in-1s. They don't sacrifice paper quality, and that way we could have the entire 42-volume series released across just 21 volumes. And there's also precedence for this because there is a 21-volume edition that's available in Japan, and in the US, Viz is really notable for copying the Japanese releases like they've done for stuff like the Fullmetal Alchemist Fullmetal editions, the Fist of the North Star hardcovers that are coming out now, and others. Now the next of the discontinued titles is Strawberry 100%, and this is the only one of these that I never owned. I never bought this one as it was coming out. It just didn't really interest me at the time. The series is a harem manga that follows a young man who wishes to be a director, and he has memories of this one girl that he saw when he was in middle school who he really was infatuated with, who had, the only thing he can remember about her is the fact that she had strawberry patterned undies. I can't speak a lot for the plot on this one because, like I said, I never had it, I never read it, but I know there are a lot of fans of this series, and I know for a fact there's a lot of people who are upset about the fact that this one was discontinued. Because in Japan, the series only lasted for 19 volumes, and then in the US, they published the first 14, so we were literally only 5 volumes, a handful of books away from completing this one. And if I was a fan of the series, I know I'd be pissed as well. However, unlike Kurohime, which also made it to 14 volumes and was only 4 volumes away from being concluded in English, this series was a lot more popular in Japan. It had OVA adaptations, video game adaptation, anime adaptations, all kinds of adaptations, and a lot of popularity overseas. So there was a lot more fandom behind this title than there was for the other. However, again, much like the other titles that I've been mentioning here, sales just were not there and it got canned at 14 volumes, and those last 5 have never been released in English. Now, while the creator Mizuki Kawashita has done a lot of other work in the manga industry, nothing else has gained the same notoriety as Strawberry 100% or Ichigo 100%. So there's not anything else for me to say similar to with Reborn that, oh, the creator's other works are popular, so maybe they can ride off of that. And so with that, I really don't have much to say about the chance of this one coming out because I don't really have a stake in this one. I'm sure if I read it and I enjoyed it, then I'd be sitting here much more adamantly saying that they should bring it back. And honestly, with all these things, especially the ones that are so close to being concluded, like this one and Kurohime, I would like to see them concluded, just so the rest of you who are fans of it can finally have those last few volumes. And so this brings us to the 7th and final of the discontinued Shonen Jump titles. And I mentioned earlier in the video that I wanted to save this one for last because it's the most recent of the discontinued series. However, also because the circumstances are very different from the sales-based reasons of the previous 6 that I've talked about. And with that, I do want to provide a trigger warning because the reason of why this series was discontinued is in relation to the crimes that the writer was found guilty of. I won't be speaking directly or in detail in this video about the writer's crime itself. However, the information is out there and available to be found easily with a quick Google search, so I want to make sure that anyone in the audience that's watching this who might be curious to find out that information for themselves is aware of what they might find and also that it might be triggering. And if you'd rather skip past this portion of the video, I'm going to provide a timestamp down below so you can move forward into my concluding thoughts and outro for this video. Of course, the title that I am referencing here is Act Age. And Act Age was poised to be one of the next big things from the Weekly Shonen Jump magazine, as it was very different from any of the typical shonen action series that made up the majority of the magazine. This one instead was more of a drama that focused on the budding career of a young method actress. It received a lot of praise from audiences, and it was even getting adapted into a stage play, and there were early talks of an anime adaptation as well. However, once information about the writer's crime had come out, everything came to a screeching halt. And in English, we had finally, in the summer of 2020, gotten the much anticipated first volume release of this series, but it was in August of 2020, right after that first volume was released, that this information came out, and very promptly Viz Media decided to abandon the plans to release the rest of the series. Now, while Viz did abandon its plans for publication of the series immediately after this news came out, the second volume had already gone to print, so it was actually distributed, and it seems like every single physical copy of Volume 2 was distributed to Barnes & Noble, because at this point, that's the only store that I feel like you can really find it at, and it is still available to purchase at Barnes & Noble. However, while Volumes 3, 4, and 5 were solicited for release through spring of 2021, all of those were completely canceled and not developed at all. Now, Act Age was not just a series by a single creator, it was shared by a writer-artist duo. So in Japan, it seemed that the publisher Shueisha actually left the decision up to the artist of whether they wanted to continue publishing this title or not. But ultimately, the artist did decide to have the series discontinued from the Weekly Shonen Jump magazine because they believed that having the series continue in the magazine could add to the trauma of those who were affected by the writer or people who were victim to similar crimes from others. And while I'm sure that this was a very difficult decision for the artist to make, as it did have a direct negative impact on their career, I do strongly believe that it was the right decision on their part. And with that, we've covered all 7 of the discontinued titles from Viz Media's Shonen Jump imprint. Now, I know that some people in the audience might be mentioning, what about this and what about that, because there are other titles that have similar circumstances, but they didn't quite fit under this topic 100%. And I'm talking about stuff like Knights of the Zodiac, Ultimate Muscle, or Prince of Tennis, where one part of the franchise was published completely, but the sequels or preceding titles were never published. Or there are other series like Cobra or City Hunter, which were Shonen Jump titles in Japan that were brought over to the US but canceled before being fully published. But for this video, I was only specifically speaking about, but for this video in particular, I was only talking about the titles that were under the Shonen Jump imprint in the US and those that were canceled before at least one part was completely published. However, I have already compiled pretty extensive notes on those other topics for future videos. Now let me know in the comments below which of these series that you would like to see brought back. For me personally, the one that is at the top of my list, the one that I enjoyed the most as I was picking up the volumes upon their original release, is Reborn, and number 2 on my list would definitely be Gintama. But I'm curious about what everyone else thinks and what you would like to see published, and also how you would like to see Viz release it. Ultimately, however you could have it done, single volumes, 2-in-1s, 3-in-1s, monthly, every other month, 3 times a year, whatever you want to see done, let me know in the comments down below, because I'm really curious about that feedback. I hope everyone enjoyed this video and spending this time with me. I hope that it was both entertaining and also informative as always. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please make sure to press the subscribe button so that you are notified of every upcoming video that I put out. Make sure to give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, and with that, I will see you all on the next one. Peace out.